The smell of a wood-burning grill has always been the smell of my son growing up. For 30 years, every backyard cookout meant charcoal smoke drifting over the fence, ice clinking in a cooler, and my late wife Dorothy laughing at something one of the neighborhood kids said. It meant my boy, Thomas, chasing fireflies until his mother called him in for dessert. It meant a kind of noise in the house that I didn't know I'd miss until it was gone. But on this particular 4th of July, as I pulled my old truck into the driveway of my son's new house, the smell of lighter fluid drifting over that manicured lawn didn't feel like home. It felt like a warning. I sat there for a minute with the engine off, gripping the wheel, telling myself I was being foolish. It was a family cookout. Nothing more. But some part of me, the part that had learned to read a room the hard way, already knew I was walking into something I wasn't going to enjoy. Being a father teaches you to carry things quietly. You spend your whole life building something for your children, not money, not property, just a way of moving through the world, with your spine straight, and you hope when they're grown, they carry a piece of it with them. You hope they remember who taught them to shake a man's hand and look him in the eye. You hope, more than anything, that you never become an inconvenience to the people you raised. But sometimes the house changes hands, and the values inside it change right along with it. That was the feeling that had been creeping up on me for the better part of a year, ever since Thomas married Jessica and Jessica's mother, a woman named Marlene, became a permanent fixture in my son's new life. I got out of the truck, smoothed down my good shirt, the blue one I'd worn to Dorothy's funeral, pressed the night before so there wouldn't be a wrinkle in it, and walked up the brick path carrying a paper sack with 2 pies I'd baked myself. Peach and apple. It wasn't much, but it was something I knew how to do with my hands, and I figured a homemade pie still counted for something, even in a house with a chandelier over the dining table. Thomas opened the door before I could knock. He looked good, tanned, a little heavier than the last time I'd seen him, wearing a golf shirt I didn't recognize. But there was something tired behind his eyes, a kind of bracing, like a man expecting bad weather. "Dad," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach all the way up. "You made it. Come on in." I stepped through the door and the smell of expensive candles hit me before anything else, vanilla and cedar, the kind of scent that costs more than my monthly water bill. The house was the sort of clean that makes you nervous to sit down. White furniture. A glass table with nothing on it but a bowl of decorative stones. Family photos on the wall, but none of them had me in them. I noticed that before anything else. 32 years of raising that boy, and not a single frame with my face in it. "Let me take those," Thomas said, nodding at the pies, though he didn't quite meet my eyes when he took the sack from my hands. That's when I heard her voice cut through the house like a dropped plate. Sharp. Amused. At something that wasn't funny. "Thomas, is that your father?" Finally. I was starting to wonder if he got lost looking for the trailer he probably lives in. A ripple of laughter followed, not from Thomas, but from somewhere in the kitchen. My stomach tightened, but I made myself walk into the living room with my chin level, the way I taught Thomas to walk into a room himself, once upon a time. Marlene was sitting in a wingback chair like she owned the deed to the county. Tall, sharp-shouldered, hair set in a way that had clearly cost real money that morning. She had a glass of white wine in one hand and a look on her face like she'd already decided everything about me before I said a word. "Good afternoon, ma'am," I said, keeping my voice easy. "Happy 4th. Thank you for having me." Oh, we didn't have much choice in the matter," she said, swirling her wine. "Jessica insisted. Something about family obligation. Personally, I thought it would be a lovely, quiet holiday without." She gestured at me with 2 fingers, like she was shooing a fly, outside company. My daughter-in-law, Jessica, came around the corner from the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was pretty in the way a magazine cover is pretty, every hair placed, every nail painted the same shade of pale pink. When Thomas had first brought her home, I'd liked her fine. She'd laughed at my jokes, helped Dorothy well, would have helped Dorothy, if Dorothy had still been alive to meet her clear the table without being asked. But something had shifted in the 2 years since the wedding, ever since Marlene started showing up to every holiday like she'd been personally invited by the calendar itself. "Mother, please," Jessica said. But there was no heat behind it. It was the tone you'd use on a toddler who'd said something a little embarrassing at the grocery store, not the tone you'd use on a grown woman insulting your father-in-law in his own son's living room. "I'm only being honest, sweetheart," Marlene said, taking another sip. It's still a free country, last I checked. I looked around the room, hoping for one familiar face that would make all of this bearable. My granddaughter, Cassie, was nowhere in sight, and 8 years old, sharp as a tack. With her grandmother Dorothy's same green eyes and the same habit of asking questions, grown-ups didn't always want to answer. She was the only reason I still drove the 40 minutes out to this house at all. But her spot on the living room rug, where she usually sat cross-legged with her tablet, was empty. "She's out back with the sprinkler," Thomas said, catching where I was looking. "She'll be thrilled you're here." "Why don't you have a seat, Dad?" he added, that same careful hand hovering near my back without quite touching me, steering me toward a leather ottoman tucked in the corner, well away from the white sectional couch that dominated the room. I understood the arrangement without being told. That couch was for people who belonged on it. I lowered myself onto the ottoman, careful not to let my old boots scuff anything, and Marlene's eyes tracked the movement like a hawk watching something limp across a field. "You know, William," she said. She always used my first name like it left a bad taste, though at least she'd bothered to learn it this time. "My late husband, Jessica's father, always said that a man's shoes tell you everything you need to know about his ambition. He'd have had a field day with yours." I felt heat rise up the back of my neck, but I'd spent 62 years learning not to hand people the satisfaction of watching me react. "I'm retired now," I said evenly. "Spent 30 years as an electrician. Kept the lights on in half this town, including, I'd wager, whatever building you do your hair in." A couple of the other guests, cousins of Jessica's I didn't recognize, actually laughed at that, and for one small moment I felt something like solid ground under my feet. Marlene's smile went thin and brittle, and she took a longer sip of her wine than the comment probably warranted. Dinner wasn't the sit-down kind Dorothy used to make. It was a buffet spread across the kitchen island: brisket, corn, a salad with ingredients I couldn't pronounce, and everyone filled a plate and scattered to different corners of the house like it was a cocktail party instead of a family holiday. I found a spot at the end of the dining table, hoping Cassie would come find me once she'd had her fill of the sprinkler. Thomas sat across from me for exactly 4 minutes before his phone buzzed and he excused himself to take a work call in the garage, leaving me alone with a plate of brisket and the low murmur of conversation happening everywhere except in my direction. That was when Marlene decided to sit down across from me. "You know," she said, setting her plate down with a delicate clink, "I do find it fascinating, the way some families just accept a certain standard of living, generation after generation. No ambition to climb higher. My family, we always pushed education, investments, and we built something. I imagine it must be freeing, in a way, to simply be content with so little." I set my fork down slowly. "I raised a good son on an electrician's wage, ma'am. Put him through college without a dollar of debt. Buried my wife with dignity, and, end quote. The prices, I don my prices, end quote. I don't know what more building looks like to you, but where I come from, that's a life well built." Of course, she said, waving a hand like she was swatting away something distasteful. "I only mean well. Look at this house. Look at what Jessica built for herself. It's a shame Thomas didn't have more of that instinct passed down to him. Must have skipped a generation or two." I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level. "My son built plenty. He built a career I'm proud of. He built a family. That's more than some people manage with all the money in the world." Something flickered across her face, a crack in the composure, quick and gone. "And that's when I made my mistake. I should have let it lie there. Instead, I said, quiet and even, you might consider, ma'am, that the people you're looking down on tonight are the same people who wired the house you're sitting in comfortable in. Someone with dirt under his nails kept the power running so your hairdryer works every morning. Might do you some good to remember that." The room didn't go silent. Not right away. The noise from the living room kept going. Someone's laughter, the television murmuring a ball game in the background. But at our end of the table, everything narrowed down to just the two of us. Marlene's hand came up so fast I didn't even see it coming until it connected a sharp crack across my cheek that snapped my head sideways and rattled my back teeth. The room did go silent then. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Someone's fork clattered against a plate. "How dare you," she hissed, though her voice was shaking, "lecture me about my own family in my daughter's home. Know your place, old man. 10. My cheek burned. My eyes stung, not from pain exactly, but from something deeper and older, the particular humiliation of being struck like a disobedient child in front of a room full of adults who all just sat there. I put my hand up to my face and I could feel it already starting to swell. I looked around the room, waiting for anyone to say something. Jessica stood frozen by the kitchen island, hand over her mouth, eyes wide but her feet planted exactly where they were. A cousin near the window looked down at his plate like it had suddenly become fascinating. And then Thomas came back in from the garage, phone still in his hand, and stopped dead in the doorway. "What happened?" he said, looking between his mother-in-law's flushed face and my reddening cheek. "Your father was extremely rude to my mother," Jessica said quickly, before Marlene could even open her mouth. "He said something awful about her family." I stared at my son, waiting for him to ask what I'd actually said. Waiting for him to ask whether a comment, however sharp, justified a grown woman striking his 62-year-old father across the face at a dinner table. He didn't ask. He looked at Marlene, then at Jessica's stricken expression, then back at me, and something in his face just deflated. "Dad," he said quietly, "maybe you should just apologize. Smooth things over. It's a holiday. Let's not ruin it." I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with the slap. "You want me to apologize?" I said slowly. "For her hitting me? Just for whatever you said. Please, Dad, for me." I looked at my son, my only child, the boy I had taught to throw a baseball in the backyard of a house I'd worked 2 jobs to keep, the boy I'd sat up with through fevers and heartbreaks and every ordinary catastrophe of growing up, and I understood, in that moment, that he had already made his choice. He wasn't going to defend me, love. He was going to ask me, to make it easy for everyone else in the room. I didn't say anything. I just sat there with my hand against my burning cheek, the taste of something bitter rising in the back of my throat. While the party slowly, awkwardly, resumed around me, hushed conversations, someone turning the television volume back up, Marlene retreating to the wingback chair with her wine like nothing at all had happened. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the shock to curdle into something colder. Long enough to notice that not one single person, not my son, not my daughter-in-law, not a single cousin at that table, had come to check whether I was all right. That's when I noticed Cassie standing in the hallway doorway. She must have come in from the backyard, still in her wet swimsuit, a towel wrapped haphazardly around her shoulders, hair dripping onto the hardwood, and in her hand, held up at chest height, angled directly at the dining room table, was her mother's old tablet. The little red recording light was on. Nobody else had noticed her yet. She'd been standing there, I would learn later, for almost the whole thing. She'd come in for a snack, seen her great-grandmother's mother raise her hand, and instead of running or crying out, she'd done the one thing an 8-year-old thinks to do when the adults around her are failing to do anything at all. She'd hit record. "Cassie, honey, what are you doing?" Jessica said, spotting her now, voice pitching up with alarm. Cassie didn't lower the tablet. She looked straight at her grandmother, at Marlene, with an expression that had none of the fear an 8-year-old is supposed to have when she's about to say something enormous to a room full of grown-ups. "You hit Grandpa William," she said, her voice small but perfectly clear, cutting through the room the way Marlene's own voice had cut through it earlier. "I saw you. And nobody did anything. And so I recorded it, because that's what you're supposed to do when something bad happens and grown-ups won't fix it." The silence that followed was different from the one after the slap. That first silence had been shock. This one was something closer to a held breath, the whole room understanding all at once what had just occurred and what it meant. "Cassie, sweetheart, give me the tablet," Jessica said, moving toward her daughter, hand outstretched, her voice gone tight and thin. "It's already live," Cassie said, taking a half step back. "I started it before I came inside because I was scared something was going to happen. It's on the family stream. Aunt Karen's watching. And Mrs. and Karen's. And Mrs. Alvarez from next door. And like 40 other people." Thomas's face went through 3 separate transformations in the space of about 2 seconds. Confusion, then dawning understanding, then something that looked almost like physical pain, the kind that comes from realizing you've made a mistake you cannot take back. "Oh my God," he whispered, looking at me with tears suddenly standing in his eyes. Dad, I'm so sorry. Jessica looked like she might actually be sick. Marlene's hand had come up to cover her mouth, her eyes darting toward the front door like she was calculating the fastest exit. But I didn't care, not in that moment, about any of their panic. I knelt down slower than I used to, my knees complaining about it, and put my hands on my granddaughter's small, still wet shoulders. Cassie, sweetheart, I said, my voice thick in a way I hadn't expected. Can I see the phone, the tablet? She handed it over, her fingers cold from the sprinkler water. I looked at the screen. The little counter in the corner of the live stream showed the viewer count climbing even as I watched 41, 43, 51. Names I recognized scrolling past in the comment feed. Aunt Karen, the Alvarez family next door, Jessica's old college roommate. People from Thomas's office, apparently invited to the family stream months ago and never removed. I scrolled further and realized it wasn't just live on that one platform. Cassie, thorough in the particular way only a kid raised on tablets can be, had it mirrored across 2 other apps at once, something she'd apparently figured out from watching her older cousins. It had already been up for almost 15 minutes. 15 minutes of Marlene's voice, clear as day, calling me an old man who didn't know his place. 15 minutes of my own son asking me to apologize for being struck. Thomas was crying now, properly, his shoulders shaking. Dad, please, we can call people, we can explain, we can say it was a joke, a misunderstanding, please don't let this. I stood back up, feeling something settle over me that I can only describe as a strange and total calm. I looked at Marlene one last time. She was trembling now. All that sharp bravado from earlier gone entirely, replaced by the particular fear of a woman realizing the whole world was about to see exactly who she was. You told me to know my place, I said, my voice low and even. You were right about one thing tonight. This was never my place. I don't think it ever was. I turned to Cassie and knelt back down, ignoring my knees this time. Buddy, I said, you just gave me the best 4th of July gift I've had in years. You have a good heart, a braver one than anybody else, standing in this room. Tonight, I stood, straightened my good blue shirt, and turned toward the front door. Thomas grabbed my arm as I passed him. Dad, please don't go. We can fix this. I can talk to Jessica. I can talk to Marlene. We can. You let her hit me, son, I said, pulling my arm gently, but firmly out of his grip. And then you asked me to apologize for it. There's no fixing tonight. There's only what you do from here. And I looked at Jessica, who hadn't moved from her spot by the kitchen island the entire time. I welcomed you into this family. I welcomed you into this family, I told her. I never once made you feel small in it. I hope, someday, you understand the difference. I walked out through that immaculate living room, past the white couch I'd never been invited to sit on, out the front door into the warm evening air, the distant sound of somebody's fireworks already starting to pop over the next neighborhood. Behind me, I could hear the chaos breaking loose inside the house. Marlene's voice rising in panic, Jessica crying, Thomas shouting something I couldn't make out. I got in my truck, sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 2 years. By the time I got home that night, my phone was already buzzing. By the next morning, it hadn't stopped. The clip just under 4 minutes, starting right at the moment Marlene's hand connected with my cheek and ending with Cassie's small, clear voice explaining exactly why she'd hit record had been pulled from the stream and reposted a dozen times over. Someone had captioned it, Grandma slaps elderly man at 4th of July barbecue, 8-year-old exposes everything. By that evening, it had climbed past 100,000 views. By the end of the week, past 2 million. The comments underneath it, when Thomas finally showed me on his phone a few days later, his voice apologetic and small, were almost entirely on my side. People from states I'd never visited writing that they wished they'd had a grandfather like me. People saying Cassie should get a medal. A few, understandably, wondering why nobody in that dining room had stepped in before an 8-year-old had to. The fallout came fast, the way these things do now. Marlene, it turned out, sat on the board of 2 charitable foundations in her city. The kind of positions built entirely on a certain public image. Within a week, both organizations issued statements distancing themselves from her and she resigned from the second board before they could vote her off it. The country club where she played tennis every Tuesday quietly declined to renew her membership. Jessica's employer, a marketing firm that had built its whole brand around modern family values, saw the clips circulate through their own staff message boards, and Jessica found herself abruptly moved off client-facing accounts pending what her supervisor called a review of recent public conduct associated with her household. Thomas called me every day for 2 weeks. I let most of them go to voicemail. The messages were always some version of the same thing, pleading, apologetic, too worried, far more. I couldn't help but notice about the business contacts who'd seen the video than about the fact that his father had been struck at his own dinner table while he stood by and asked for an apology instead of offering one. He never once, in any of those messages, said the word sorry for what he'd actually done. He was sorry he'd gotten caught in the middle of it. That's a different thing entirely, and at 62 years old, I've learned the difference matters. I did eventually pick up 3 weeks later when Jessica called instead of Thomas. Not to reconcile, I wasn't ready for that, and I told her so plainly, but because she said Cassie had been asking about me every single day, wanting to know why Grandpa William hadn't come to see her, worried that she'd done something wrong by hitting record. That, more than anything, is what finally cracked something open in me. The idea that my granddaughter, the only person in that entire house who'd had the courage to do the right thing, might be sitting somewhere thinking she'd broken her family instead of saving what little dignity was left in it. I drove out to see her the following Saturday. Not to the house, I made that clear, but to the little park near her school, the one with the pond where Dorothy used to take Thomas to feed the ducks a lifetime ago. Cassie ran at me the second she saw my truck pull in, faster than I expected for a kid who'd been worried sick for 3 weeks, and threw her arms around my waist so hard I nearly lost my footing. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," she said into my shirt. "I didn't mean for everybody to be mad. I just didn't want them to pretend it didn't happen." Quote. I knelt down, knees complaining as always, and held her by the shoulders the way I had that night in the dining room. "Cassie," I told her, "you did not do one single thing wrong. Not one. You were the only person in that whole house who acted like a grown-up. Don't you ever, for 1 second, feel sorry for telling the truth." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, and then, because she is 8 and 8-year-olds recover faster than the rest of us, she asked if we could go feed the ducks, and just like that, the heaviness lifted enough for both of us to breathe. I still haven't spoken to Marlene, and I don't expect I ever will. Thomas and I are talking again, slowly, carefully, the way you rebuild something after a fire, checking each board before you trust your weight on it. He drove out to my place a month later, sat on my porch, and, for the first time in longer than I could remember, actually apologized. Not for getting caught. For the years of small compromises that had led him to a table where he watched his own father get struck and asked for an apology instead of giving one. It wasn't everything. But it was a start, and at my age I've learned to be grateful for honest starts. Jessica and I are civil, at least, mostly for Cassie's sake, and I suspect that will have to be enough for a while. What I keep coming back to, on the nights I can't sleep, isn't the slap itself. It wasn't even the worst part, if I'm honest. The worst part was the silence that followed it, the particular, hollow silence of a room full of grown adults who had every reason to speak up and chose comfort instead. What healed something in me wasn't revenge, and I want to be clear that none of what happened afterward was something I planned or wanted. It was simply the truth, finally spoken out loud, by the one person in that house too young to have learned yet that silence is sometimes easier than doing the right thing. My granddaughter gave me back something I didn't even know I'd lost that night, not justice, exactly, but dignity. And sometimes, at the end of a long life, that's the only inheritance that actually matters.